Sally McFaig, in her book Blessed Are the Consumers, points out a basic spiritual principle that everything is related to everything else. It is a phrase that is becoming increasingly referenced, if not popular, because it pushes against our current characteristics of our consumeristic society, based on our narcissistic ways that whatever we do, we tend to do for ourselves without great concern about how our actions might impact another. She suggests that as a spiritual person, we are asking ourselves the question, how do we live well on this planet? Because how we live does, in fact, impact how others live. This morning's passage, taken from Jeremiah, is part of a larger collection of writings, sometimes known as the Book of Comfort, or the Book of Consolation. It is written during the latter days of the Babylonian exile, and it was written to promise hope and renewal of the covenant to those that had been in exile, those that were feeling weary, oppressed, depressed after their many years away from what had been familiar to them. The promise of a new day, or the Lord's Day, was related to the Hebrew understanding of the year of the Jubilee. It was said to be a time when debts would be canceled, slaves freed, stolen property returned, and all creation would return to their original owner or creator, God. The initial covenant between Yahweh and the Hebrew people who had been enslaved was the promise to worship God alone and to treat others as God had treated them. They were called to live lives different from the other nations, based on justice, care of the stranger, the widow, the orphan. It included forgiveness of debts and generosity toward neighbor and friends. It was really a call to ethical living toward both the weak and the marginalized. Yahweh said, "Remember, you were a slave in Egypt, therefore I command you to do this." You can imagine when you've had that kind of experience that your sense of empathy and compassion for another who is struggling is that much stronger. Living well meant caring for others as well as yourself. Readers of Jeremiah understood how important this new covenant was to be. God had liberated them from slavery and delivered them to a promised land so that they would be different from their neighbors. They would create a community of justice in which the weak, the widows, the orphans, the aliens, the poor would be cared for. Jubilee laws described a kingdom with radically just values, the values of a world as God had intended it. Slavery of your neighbors, which in Israel was almost always caused by indebtedness, would be banned. Slavery of foreigners would be canceled after 7 years. Aid would be given to neighbors, and I think my battery just died on me. Oh, it came back. Okay, we'll just keep going here. So aid would be given to neighbors in need, and one was not allowed to give aid to a friend or family member in need in such a way as to turn a profit for yourself. Think of the cash money kiosks that we have in our neighborhoods. They'll give you cash free, but not really free. It's convenient, but not free. But instead of this Jubilee kingdom, the Israelites evolved into a society of economic exploitation and oppression, rivaling that of their neighbors. The result of all this for Jeremiah was that God responded to their violation of the covenant, it is said, by delivering them into a second slavery, this time in Babylon. With the fall of Jerusalem itself, the wealthy, the powerful, the royal families of Israel were all deported to Babylon for almost 50 years. This geopolitical event was, according to Jeremiah and other theologians of the period, a direct result of their acts of oppressing the poor and worshiping idols, two major tenets of the covenant that they had broken. But now, says Jeremiah, in spite of their faults, despite the fact that they had not followed the rules, God would give them a second chance, a second opportunity to bring about the world that God intended. God was now promising to make available for them a new covenant. It would not be new in terms of content. The Torah would still be its basis, but more in terms of place. This covenant, which would be made available to them, would not be imposed upon them from the outside, but would be within them, written in their hearts. The heart for Jeremiah is the seat of the will. When the heart was evil, one turned from God and did evil. But when the heart was good, one turned to God and did good. But according to Jeremiah, the hearts of the people of Israel had become sinful. The heart is deceitful above all things and desperately corrupt. Who can understand it? This people has a stubborn and rebellious heart. They have turned aside and gone away. They do not say in their hearts, "Let us fear the Lord our God, who gives rain in its season, the autumn rain and the spring rain, and keeps for us the weeks appointed for the harvest." In a passage that anticipates the one for today, Yahweh makes the promise to the exiles that I will give them a heart to know that I am the Lord, and they shall be my people. And I will be their God, for they shall turn to me with their whole heart. While on holiday over the last few weeks, our family had rented a condo, and it was in fact for sale. So we had agreed that we would make it available for showings and open houses as needed. Sounded like a good idea at the time, but when you're there on holiday, So during my stay, there was an open house, and we did our best to make everything look its best. And as I was scrubbing the kitchen sink and making sure fresh towels were laid out on all of the bathrooms, my son commented about doing all this extra work. And I said, "Well, honey, I'd like to think that if it were my condo for sale, my tenant would make the same effort on my behalf to help me sell it as what I was trying to do for these owners." My son kind of rolled his eyes and commented that he didn't think many people thought or acted like that these days. "Really, Mom?" That I was unusual. "Do unto others as you would have them do unto you," I said. "Remember, you were once a slave in Egypt. Therefore, I command you to do this." One of the reflections on Lent that I read said how it was a time to put your faith into action, to go from belief alone to actually living differently because of your belief. I think our faith challenges us to do that even more so today. There was a time when everyone went to church, everyone pretty much held the same values and codes of living, but I realize more and more each day that that is not always the case. And how we live toward one another, our neighbor, the stranger, the widow, the orphan, the earth, matters even more, because much of our society is too consumed by their own needs and worries. Sally McFaig, in her book Blessed Are the Consumers, speaks of house rules that we as religious or spiritual people live by. And in her case, she refers to our relations not only to our neighbors, the strangers, the widow, the orphan, but she refers to how we treat our planet. She says many people today live as if the planet were a hotel and not our home. We are content to leave towels on the floor, run long hot showers, and leave the room without making the bed, with the understanding that it is someone else's job to pick up and clean up after us. Now, I know there are many of you here who would not leave a hotel with the towels on the floor and the bed unmade, but many do. And yet she said, if we thought of the earth more as our home, then we would take more responsibility to care for it, to be grateful for what it gives us, and to do our best to leave it as we found it. She describes what she calls house rules, and to me they sound a lot like covenant words or laws to be written on our hearts. Take only your share. Clean up after yourself. Keep the house in good repair. Simple, basic rules that can make a world of difference. Now, apparently, Archbishop Desmond Tutu was discussing this whole sense of covenant rules and house rules of the people of Israel to a confirmation class, and he was describing the Mosaic covenant, and he went step by step through it, explaining the promise of God, that God would rescue the Hebrew people from slavery and that they would worship only God, and then act in ways that show themselves to be that liberated people. And he showed them how that principle showed up in the teachings of Jesus later on, do unto others. When finished, he asked them as a review to tell him what he had just said. And he got a variety of attempts, and some close and some not so close. But then one little boy raised his hand and put it better than any theologian he had ever heard before. He said, quoting God, "I saved your butts, now you guys behave." Yeah, I guess that works. Living well as a people of faith is about living in ways that show care and concern about all and not just ourselves. It is about being God's people and living God's ways, not just by set rules, but by acts that are based on a loving and compassionate heart. It is an understanding that we have received grace in our own lives, therefore we cannot stand in judgment of another. It is knowing God is at the center of all we do and living well by following God's ways for us and the world. It is taking our beliefs and putting them into action for a loving and just world that God intended. Amen.